Okay, we're on section 4 of the overview handout. This one's about minimal pairs and mental representations. So last time we talked a little bit about the mental lexicon. You have to memorize the words of your language because they're unpredictable. What the sound of a word is going to be is not something you can predict from rules. It's something that you just have to learn and memorize. And so we call whatever the place is where you store those sounds and meanings of different morphemes in your language, we call that the mental lexicon. Right? So what's in there? Well, lexical entries. Right? And if you have two different morphemes or two different words in your language that are consistently pronounced differently and that mean different things, that means they must be memorized separately. And if there's a consistent sound difference in particular, then whatever that difference is, it has to be represented in your mental grammar somehow. You have to be able to encode the differences between the sounds that distinguish, minimally distinguish word meanings or morpheme meanings in your language. And that's useful and interesting because it means that we can ask about what a minimal difference in sounds is, right? It's going to be all the single sound differences that can be used to consistently distinguish word meanings in your language, right? So for instance, the fact that in English the words bit and beat are pronounced differently and they mean different things entails that an English speaker who has internalized these lexical entries must represent the difference between the vowel I in bit and the vowel E in beat in their lexicon. Right? So whatever those lexical entries look like, one of them is going to have something like this in it. This is for beat, right? And whatever the meaning of that is, it's going to be linked to this. Let's say for the moment that it's like a red vegetable with a root, right? Something like that, that kind of a beat. There's going to be a separate lexical entry somewhere in your mental lexicon for the word bit, and I don't know how to draw a bit, but imagine something here. It doesn't really matter what. Whatever bit refers to, that's going to be the meaning. So you have an arbitrary pairing of these sounds with the meaning of bit, an arbitrary pairing of these sounds with the meaning of beat, and when you go to retrieve these words and speak them, they come out sounding different. Therefore, this thing has to be represented differently from this thing, right? If these words came out sounding the same, maybe like the vegetable beat and the verb beat, to win or to do better than someone, those wouldn't necessarily need to be represented differently on the sound side. They'd have the same representation because they both sound like beat, but they'd have different meanings. The fact that these mean different things and they're consistently pronounced differently means that this distinction between E and I has to be something that English speakers have in their mental lexicon, that they represent in some way. Right? Now, we can ask, we've been asking for everything that we've seen in this handout so far, is this universal or is it language specific? And of course, having minimal lexical contrasts is universal. All languages have some set of contrasting sounds that can distinguish word meanings. But which sounds go into those contrasts is language specific. It varies language by language. In particular, I've picked this example, beat versus bit, because lots of other languages, most other languages, don't distinguish two vowels like these. English is sort of weird in this regard. The English vowel system is extremely involved and kind of messy. And this is often difficult for second language speakers to both produce and to perceive. This difference between, these are called tense vowels, these are called lax vowels, and we'll get into that difference in the next week. So that's the question here in the handout. Is the same thing true in your language? Can you have minimal word meanings that are distinguished by a vowel like E versus a vowel like I? Probably not if you're not a speaker of English. Right? So this is an interesting fact. The inventory of contrastive sounds differs from language to language. And you'll hear this, the whole set of contrastive sounds in a language, sometimes referred to as the inventory or the phonological inventory of the language. And inventories are language specific. There are some rules and generalizations about what inventories look like across languages. but it's not determined. There's no universal phonetic or phonological inventory across languages. What does that mean? Well, infants must go through some process of learning the inventories of their language. Right? Otherwise, you wouldn't ever be able to figure out what's a minimal contrast and what isn't. That's something that adult speakers implicitly know and represent in their lexicons, but it can't be something infants are born with because it's not the same in every language. Therefore, infants must need to learn these minimal contrasts on a language-specific basis. So these are, as I mentioned, referred to as tense versus lax vowels. In particular, this is the tense versus lax high front vowel. E is tense and I is lax. We also have mid-front vowels, and so this would be the vowels in bait versus bet. And so again, because these mean different things in English, they're going to have to be represented separately in the lexicon. The lax one here, is written with this sort of epsilon sign. The tense vowels in English, at least the non-high tense vowels, phonetically sort of have a diphthong quality. What does that mean? A diphthong is a vowel that starts with one sound and ends with a different sound. And so in particular, this mid-vowel A in English has what's sometimes called an off-glide. So it starts like E and it ends like E. And you'll see that written in a bunch of different ways, sometimes like that, sometimes in different ways. I'm going to just leave the plain letter E here, because even though phonetically it's a diphthong, in the phonology it just works like a normal mid-vowel. So bait versus bet. Okay. So this is, again, a tense versus lax distinction. We know that's represented in the English lexicon because this is something that you use to try to catch fish, and this is something that you do when you make an agreement with somebody for certain amounts of money to be paid conditioned on future circumstances. That's what you do when you bet somebody. And so these mean different things. They have different vowels in them. This tense versus lax vowel distinction must be part of the English phonological inventory. It's contrastive in English. So interestingly, most varieties of Spanish, and here, there is no single Spanish phonology, but in most varieties of peninsular Spanish, which is what a lot of the people in this class speak, you've actually find both of these vowels. Right? If you listen to words in those varieties of Spanish, you will hear versions of e and versions of but they're never minimally contrastive in Spanish. So even though you get this vowel and you get this vowel, you never get pairs of words that only differ in their vowel. So for instance, the first vowel in the word for hair, which is something like pelo, that's this kind of a vowel, e. And that's usually different from the first vowel in the word, again, I can't pronounce the trill, but it's something like perro, right? That means dog, and that's a different vowel. It's a more kind of a vowel. But that's not the only difference between those words, right? So here again is the word for hair, something like pelo. The word for dog is something like perro, where this normal R symbol stands for a trill. That should be the lax vowel. And yes, this one has a tense vowel, this one has a lax vowel, but there's something else different here. The consonant sound that follows these two vowels is also different. It's not just the vowels themselves, and that turns out to be important because it turns out you can never actually get a pair of Spanish words that differ only in these vowels, with the exception of Murcian Spanish, which again a number of people in our program speak, but Murcia works differently, and we'll ignore that for the moment. Right? In other varieties of Spanish, these vowels are never contrastive. Right? Why are they never minimally contrastive? Well, it turns out that they are phonologically predictable. If you have a mid-front vowel, and you tell me what kinds of sounds are appearing around it, I will be able to tell you whether it's going to be a tense mid-front vowel or a lax mid-front vowel. So at a first pass, you're always going to find something like this A vowel when it's followed by a sequence like this, like a consonant and a vowel, where the consonants, for instance, a l. And in this context, where you're before a trill sound, you're basically always going to find this lax variant, right? So what does that mean? Well, at a first pass, Spanish speakers don't need to memorize these lexical entries with tense versus lax vowels, right? Because it's never minimally contrastive in their language. They can just use either the tense variant or the lax variant and then figure out where the other one appears based on the phonological context. It's phonologically predictable. So we can get rid of this tense lax feature in our lexicon, which is good because that's going to save lots of memory. And then we can figure out where to put the tense and the lax ones based on the phonological context. It's phonologically predictable. Right? English speakers, on the other hand, need to memorize these with different vowels because it's not phonologically predictable. Right? So again, when I use the word predictability in this class, it's always referring to phonological predictability. So that is, given a phonological context, given a set of sounds that surround it, can you predict which value, in this case, the feature tense lax will have? And in English, you can't, right? If I tell you, hey, here's an English word. It begins with a b and it ends with a t, and it has a mid-front vowel in between them. Is that vowel tense or lax? The answer is, I don't know. It depends on which word it is. If it's bait, then it's tense. If it's bet, then it's lax. It's not predictable from the phonology or from the phonetics. In Spanish, on the other hand, if I tell you, hey, I got this word. It begins with a p, and then there's a vowel, and it's followed by a trill, and this vowel is a mid-front vowel, is it tense or lax? You will be able to tell me, hey, it must be lax, because that vowel is always lax before a trill. It's predictable. You don't even need to know which word I'm talking about or what it means. You can predict what kind of a vowel is going to pop up in there. In English, these pairs of sounds that differ only in their vowels are referred to as a minimal pair. And they're used to demonstrate that some feature or some difference between two sounds is contrastive in the language in question. In fact, this is how we argue that features are contrastive. Look, there's a minimal pair. Therefore, tense vowels must be represented differently from lax vowels in the English lexicon. Right? In Spanish, there's no such argument, right? Because you can't find a minimal pair of tense versus lax vowels. If they differ in tense versus lax, they're always going to differ in at least one other thing. So we refer to these unpredictable distributions as being contrastive, right? Because in English, this is a possible meaning contrast. It's unpredictable because you can't tell me what kind of a vowel is going to be in there. And it's sometimes referred to as lexical, right? So is vowel tenseness and laxness is lexical in English in the sense that it's stored in the mental lexicon, right? In Spanish, it's none of these things. So in Spanish, we would say that this tense-lax difference, or the tense-lax feature, right, is phonologically predictable. It's non-contrastive, right, because it doesn't minimally distinguish word meanings, and it's not stored in the lexicon. Right? So that's tense-lax in Spanish. Predictable, non-contrastive, and not lexical. These all, for the purposes of phonology, mean basically the same thing, and we're going to use all of these terms. They're sort of interchangeable. This feature in this language is non-contrastive, it's not lexical, and it is phonologically predictable. This feature in English, on the other hand, is phonologically unpredictable. It's contrastive, right, and it is lexical. It's stored in the lexicon, that difference. So I picked the tense and lax vowels here because it makes an interesting contrast between English and Spanish, which is the second most spoken language in this class. But of course, there's all sorts of sounds and features that differ from language to language in whether they're contrastive or not. So here's another example. English has both oral vowels and nasal vowels. Now this might come as a surprise to English speakers because it's not obvious at all that we actually have nasal vowels. It's not something we hear very easily. But if you go look at a recording of a word like pad, that has an oral vowel in it, and then go look at a recording of a word like pan, you'll find that the vowels are actually rather different. That vowel before the n sound in pan is kind of like an vowel. That's a nasal vowel. Right? Why don't English speakers normally know this or recognize it unless they've taken a phonology class? Well, because it's not a minimally contrastive difference in English. Right? This is never the only thing that separates two English words from each other. There's always some other difference. In this case, as you may have noticed, the difference is that in pan, there's a nasal consonant that comes after the vowel. So at a first pass, English vowels are nasalized before a nasal consonant, but elsewhere, where they're not before a nasal consonant, like in pad, they're oral. So it's, again, phonologically predictable in English whether a vowel is going to be oral or nasal. If I give you a word like this and tell you, hey, there's a vowel in here, it's preceded by a p and followed by a n, is it going to be oral or nasal? It's predictably going to be nasal. You can answer that question in English. It's predictable, not contrastive. There's no minimal pairs here, and we don't think that this is stored in the English lexicon. On the other hand, in French, it appears that vowel nasality is minimally contrastive. So just for one example, you can get many, many minimal pairs in French, but here's a minimal pair. The French word veau, right, with an oral vowel, means veal. This is the meat of a young cow. You make that vowel nasal, vont, and it means they go. Although it means it's a form of the verb go that's third person plural. Right? And yeah, this is the only difference between these two words. These two words have to be encoded differently in the lexicon in French, and there's many other minimal pairs like this. And therefore, in French, we'd have to say that vowel nasality is minimally contrastive, it's unpredictable, and it's stored in the lexicon. If I give you this context and say, hey, here's a French word, it begins with a v and it ends with a vowel, is the vowel oral or nasal? You can't tell me the answer. It's unpredictable, right? Based only on the sounds. You'd have to know which word it is, right? So again, phonologically unpredictable and contrastive in French, phonologically predictable and non-contrastive in English. So we think that a French speaker would represent this feature in their lexicon, and an English speaker probably wouldn't, or at least they wouldn't need to. Let's put it that way.